On a hot August afternoon in 1984, a small blonde man died alone in a borrowed bedroom in Los Angeles. He had been the most famous writer in America. He had thrown the most famous party in America. He had been loved by the 6 most beautiful and most guarded women in America. None of them came to the funeral. None of them sent flowers. 9 years earlier, he had sat at a typewriter in a Manhattan apartment and, in 44 pages of magazine fiction, named every secret they had ever trusted him with. He sold their lives to Esquire for $16,000. He spent the rest of his own life paying for it. If you enjoy the stories the history books were too polite to write down, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. The next one is already coming. Chapter 1. The Small Man Who Collected Queens. He arrived in Manhattan with no money, no name, and a Louisiana accent he refused to lose. And within 10 years, 6 of the richest women in America were on first-name terms with him. His real name was Truman Streckfus Persons. He was born on September the 30th, 1924, in New Orleans, to a teenage mother who did not want him, and a small-time confidence man who could not keep her. By the age of 4, he had been left with relatives in Monroeville, Alabama, while his mother tried to make a different life somewhere else. He grew up in a hot wooden house where the screens never quite kept the insects out, surrounded by elderly cousins. He read everything in the local library. He wore costumes. He talked even then, like a small theatrical adult. When his mother finally collected him, she had remarried a Cuban-born textile broker in New York named Joseph Capote, and Truman took his stepfather's surname. He arrived in the city in the late 1930s as a small, blonde, peculiar boy of 11 who was already certain that he was a writer. He did not graduate from a famous university. He did not graduate from any university. He took a job as a copy boy at The New Yorker. He was fired for irritating the poet Robert Frost. He began publishing short stories at 21. In 1948, he was 23 years old and the author of a first novel called Other Voices, Other Rooms. The book sold well. The dust jacket photograph sold better. He posed reclining on a sofa, looking directly at the camera with an expression that several critics called knowing and several others called something less polite. The photograph traveled around literary New York in a week. He had decided, by the time of that photograph, what he wanted. He did not want to be merely a great writer. There were already several of those in the room. He wanted to be a great writer who was inside the rooms the other great writers could not enter. He wanted very specifically the houses on Fifth Avenue, the boxes at the Metropolitan Opera, the private planes, the small black book of telephone numbers. He understood, in a way that almost no one of his class understood, that those rooms were not closed by money alone. They were closed by intimacy. To get in, you had to be useful to someone already inside. He made himself useful. He listened. This was the rarest thing of all. He had grown up among elderly Southern women who would talk for hours if a child sat still and looked attentive, and he had learned, by the age of 7, that the way to be loved by a powerful woman was to pay close attention to what she said about other women. He brought that childhood discipline north. He took it into the drawing rooms of Park Avenue. He found, to his quiet satisfaction, that the women on Park Avenue were as starved for an attentive ear as the cousins in Alabama had been. They had husbands who did not listen. They had friends who were rivals. They had nobody to whom they could safely complain. He gave them somebody. The first true entry point came in February of 1955, when he was 30, and was sent by the producer David O. Selznick to join the troupe of Porgy and Bess on a State Department tour to the Soviet Union. He never reached Russia for that particular trip, but on a plane back from a related visit, he found himself seated next to a tall, dark-haired woman of 40 named Barbara Cushing Mortimer Paley. She had 3 husbands' worth of social experience already at her shoulder. She had a recent book of magazine covers and a husband, William Paley, who had built the Columbia Broadcasting System into the largest television network in the world. She was, in 1955, considered the most stylish woman in America. He listened. By the end of the flight, she had told him things she had never told her sisters. Within 2 years, he had a guest room at the Paley's Long Island estate, Kaluna Farm. Within 3 years, he was being asked along on Bill Paley's yacht. By 1958, the year Breakfast at Tiffany's came out, he was a fixture. From Babe, he met the others. The world he wanted opened around him. He understood what he had been led into. He also understood what they wanted from him. He filed it all. Chapter 2. A word. He invented for them. He called them his swans, and he meant the word literally because he had decided that what they were was very long-necked, very beautiful, and only one wrong wind away from drowning. There were 6 of them. He met them in a particular order, and the order matters because each one introduced him to the next. Babe Paley was the first and the center. Born Barbara Cushing on July 5, 1915, she was the middle of the 3 Cushing sisters whose physician father, Harvey Cushing, was a pioneering neurosurgeon and whose mother, Catherine, was a strategic mother of the kind history mostly forgets to name. The eldest sister, Minnie, married Vincent Astor. The youngest, Betsy, married first the son of a president and then John Hay Whitney, an ambassador and one of the richest men in America. Babe drew the largest fish. She married in 1947 after a brief first marriage to Stanley Mortimer, the founder of CBS. She brought to the marriage a face that fashion editors quietly admitted was the only face they could put on any cover at any time and sell out the issue. She was named to the International Best Dressed list 14 times. She entered the list's Hall of Fame the year it was created. The second was Nancy Hawks Hayward, called Slim. She was born in Salinas, California on July 15, 1917. She came east through Hollywood, married first to the director Howard Hawks, then to the Broadway producer Leland Hayward, and finally, after the events of this story, to the English banker Sir Kenneth Keith. She was the wittiest of the 6 and the most ruthless of the talkers. She had the long, lean West Coast carriage that the photographer George Hurrell had immortalized in the late 1930s. She had also been credited quietly as the original of Lauren Bacall's screen persona, on the strength of one of Howard Hawks' productions. The third was Gloria Rubio Yai Alatorre, who became Gloria Guinness. She was born on August 27, 1912, in Veracruz, Mexico. Her early life crossed Berlin, Paris, and the salons of wartime Europe in ways she never explained on the record. She married 4 times, the last inconsequential time in 1951 to Lowell Guinness of the banking branch of the Guinness family, who was repeatedly listed in the 1960s among the 10 richest men in the world. She was the most beautiful woman Diana Vreeland would ever see. She was also, throughout her life, the subject of rumors that she had carried messages for German contacts in occupied Europe. The fourth was Marella Caracciolo di Castagneto, who became Marella Agnelli on her marriage in 1953 to Gianni Agnelli, the head of Fiat. She brought the longest neck and the most photographed shoulders in Europe. Richard Avedon photographed her in a now famous image in which her neck dominates the frame and her gaze does not. She was the swan of swans by Capote's own private ranking, and she was also the one swan he could never get to confess. The fifth was Caroline Lee Bouvier, called Lee, who was Jacqueline Kennedy's younger sister. Born in 1933, she was 20 years younger than Babe, and the swan with whom Capote was most genuinely intimate, the one he traveled with, ate with, called every morning. She had married a Polish prince named Stanislaw Radziwill in 1959, while her sister was on her way to the White House. She lived in London. She tried at various points to act, to write, to photograph. Capote helped her with all of it. The sixth was Anne Eden Crowell, who became Anne Woodward. She was born in 1915 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the daughter of a streetcar conductor. She arrived in New York as a model and radio actress. She married, in 1943, William Woodward, Jr., of the Hanover National Bank family. She was loathed from the first meeting by his mother, Elsie Woodward, who controlled the family money. She was the swan the others were uneasy about. She had killed her husband on a night in 1955, in a way that the grand jury cleared and society did not. These were the six. Each one had married a man whose fortune dwarfed her own. Each one lived inside a marriage that, in private, was not what the magazines pretended. Each one needed a friend who could not divorce her, could not sleep with her husband, and could not, by any of the rules of their world, ever betray her. They had decided, collectively, that Capote was that friend. He had decided to write about them. Yestis Chapter 3. The Booth That Ruled New York. Every weekday between 12:45 and 3 in the afternoon, an unremarkable corner of East 55th Street decided who counted in America. The address was 5 East 55th, The restaurant was La Côte Bosque. It had been opened in 1958 by a Frenchman named Henri Soulet, who had run Le Pavillon up the block before a salary dispute pushed him out. Soulet took his best waiters with him. He took his best customers with him. Within a year of opening, La Côte Basque had become the most important restaurant in New York and, by reasonable extension, the most important restaurant in the country. The room itself was not enormous. It seated, on a busy day, perhaps 120. It was decorated with murals of the Basque coast, painted by Bernard Lamotte, which gave the whole space a slightly theatrical quality. The walls were a soft cream. The banquettes were red. The food, by reputation at least, was conservatively excellent. Soulet's quenelles de brochet were spoken of with the same gravity that a different kind of critic might reserve for Vermeer. The food was not the point. The point was the seating chart, which Soulet maintained himself, and which functioned as a public ranking of who that day was inside and who was out. The most coveted tables were 3 banquettes against the back wall. From those banquettes, the entire room was visible. From the rest of the room, the banquettes were visible. To be seated at one of those 3 tables was to be seen by everyone, and to see everyone simultaneously. To be seated at one of the small tables near the kitchen door was to have been told, without anyone saying the words aloud, that you were no longer of consequence. The clientele was a tiny world. The same 150 people, give or take 20, occupied that room 3 or 4 times a week between 1958 and the middle of the 1970s. Babe Paley was there. Slim Hayward was there. Gloria Guinness was there when she was not in Switzerland. Marella Agnelli was there when the Italian schedule allowed. Radziwill was there when she was in New York. They sat usually at the same back banquette. Soulet reserved it for them. They drank Bloody Marys at the start. They smoked all of them, even Babe, whose lungs were already beginning to fail her in private. They ate small portions. They asked the waiter for a sole meunière and ate 3 bites of it. They drank glasses of white burgundy. They never ordered dessert. The serious business of the lunch was not the food. It was the talk. The talk in the world they ruled was the only inheritance a woman could not be cheated out of by her husband's lawyers. A married woman could lose her access to capital. She could lose the house if the divorce went badly. She could lose her standing on charity boards if her social position weakened. She could not lose what she had heard. The booth was the bank. They deposited stories in it. They drew interest in the form of knowing nods and slight raisings of eyebrows. They had, over years of practice, developed an entire grammar of glance that communicated, without ever naming a name, exactly which husband was unfaithful, which wife was drunk by 11 in the morning, and which marriage was nearly over. Into that booth, in the 1960s, Truman Capote was admitted as a regular. He sat on the women's side, never on a man's side. He drank his vodka. He listened. He occasionally contributed a piece of gossip from a different precinct, by way of paying his entry fee. He laughed at the right moments. He never wrote anything down at the table. He went home and wrote it down at home. He used a small notebook. He called it his Swan diary, although in his published correspondence, he also called it his Proust diary, because by the early 1960s, he had decided that what he was secretly accumulating was the material for a great social novel modeled on Marcel Proust, which would do for post-war Manhattan and Paris what Proust had done for the Faubourg Saint-Germain in the years before the First World War. The novel had a title. The title was Answered Prayers. It came from a line of Saint Teresa of Avila. The line ran, "More tears are shed over answered prayers than over unanswered ones." He had no other prayer than to be inside that booth. He had been answered. He was already beginning to weep. Chapter 4. The Bedroom Behind Babe's Pearls. William S. Paley owned the most powerful television network in the world and could not keep his hands off his secretaries, his guests, or, on at least one occasion, his wife's closest friend. To understand what Babe Paley told Truman Capote, one has to understand what Bill Paley did with his evenings, his mornings, and a substantial portion of his afternoons. The CBS chairman was, by every contemporary account that has survived in the form of letters or oral histories, a sexual compulsive in the modern clinical sense. He pursued women on a daily basis. He did not pursue them only in private. He pursued them in front of his wife at his own dinner table. He kept apartments in Midtown Manhattan, including, by reliable account, more than one on floors above the CBS headquarters at Black Rock, in which he met women in the late afternoons before returning home in time to change for dinner. He had begun this pattern in his first marriage to Dorothy Hart Hearst Paley in the 1930s. He continued it without break into his marriage to Babe. Babe had grown up in a household where her father, Harvey Cushing, had been a difficult man, and her mother, Catherine, had taught her daughters that the work of a wife was the maintenance of the marriage, regardless of provocation. Babe had been a beauty since adolescence. She had been used to being looked at. She was not used to being humiliated. Bill humiliated her by habit. The specific cruelties were itemized, years later, in the testimony of friends to her biographers. He criticized her menus in front of her guests. He told her at table that her napkins were folded incorrectly. He sometimes refused to eat what she had ordered for dinner and asked the cook to bring him something else, while the rest of the table waited. He made jokes about her clothing in mixed company. The jokes were always about the price. He had paid for the clothes. He wanted everyone to know how much. His infidelities were not discreet. Babe discovered some of them by reading the bills he left on his desk. Hotel charges, florist receipts addressed to women she did not know, restaurant tabs from afternoons when he had told her he was at the office. She made, for years, a private record of the dates and the amounts. She did not confront him with the record. She kept it as the kind of evidence a woman of her class kept against a marriage she could not, in the world of 1957 or 1964, dissolve without destroying her sisters, her social position, and the public image of the man who employed half of Midtown Manhattan. She told Truman everything. She told him about the bill stubs. She told him about a specific weekend at Kiluna when she had walked into the wrong bedroom and found her husband with another guest. She told him the name of the guest. She told him about the maid who, the morning after the discovery, had stripped the bed and changed the sheets and asked Babe, very quietly, what she would like done. She told him about the lung cancer she had not yet been diagnosed with, but suspected was coming. She told him about the 3 packs of cigarettes a day she could not give up. She told him that she had stopped, around the age of 50, hoping that anything would change. He listened. He filed. Babe smoked Carltons. She smoked them in a particular way, holding the cigarette at the very end so that her fingers never yellowed. She drank, on the evenings of bad days, 3 or 4 glasses of vodka over ice with 1 olive. She was, by the time Capote was sitting beside her on the train back from Long Island in 1967, taking a small dose of a barbiturate in the evenings to sleep. She had also, by the same year, hired a separate cook to prepare her own meals so that her husband could refuse them without affecting the rest of the table. The cost of the marriage, in dollars, ran higher than almost any private household in America. The Paleys maintained Kiluna with a permanent staff of approximately 11. They maintained the St. Regis apartment with another staff. They held a private art collection that, by the time of Babe's death in 1978, was widely understood to be among the 3 or 4 largest in the United States. They flew on private aircraft. Babe spent, in clothes alone, between $100,000 and $150,000 a year through the 1960s, which, in the money of 2024, sits between roughly $900,000 and $1.5 million annually. She had everything. She had nothing of the one thing she had married for. She told Truman that too. She told him at the back banquette at La Côte Basque over a Bloody Mary in the year 1967. She did not know that he was already drafting a chapter in which a thinly veiled version of her husband, called Sidney Dillon, would be discovered in a hotel bed with a wife of a senator. She did not know that the wife of the senator would be described in such physical detail that everyone of their generation would recognize the original, who was Marie Harriman, the wife of Averell Harriman, although, in the published version, the senator's name and party would be slightly altered. The wife in the story would be called Cleo Dillon. Cleo Dillon would have a name that everyone would understand was Babe. She did not know any of this in 1967. She thought she was talking to her friend. Chapter 5. The Showgirl Who Pulled the Trigger. At 2 in the morning on October 30th, 1955, Ann Woodward fired a shotgun into the dark hallway of her Long Island estate and killed her husband while he was holding a loaded gun of his own. The estate was called the Playhouse. It sat in Oyster Bay Cove, on land that had once belonged to the larger Woodward holdings. William Woodward Jr. was the son of the William Woodward Sr. who had run the Hanover National Bank, and who had been one of the great thoroughbred owners in American racing. The family was old. The family was loaded. The family had not wanted William Jr. to marry Anne. Anne had been born Angeline Lucille Crowell in Pittsburgh, Kansas in 1915. Her father, by various accounts, was a streetcar conductor, by other accounts, a worker on the railroads. She had left Kansas in her late teens, made her way to New York, and become, in stages, a showgirl at the Fitzgerald, a radio actress on a daytime mystery serial, and a part-time model. She had met William Jr. on a blind date set up by friends in 1942. They had married in 1943 while he was in the Navy. Elsie Crider Woodward, William Jr.'s mother, did not approve. She had spent the entire marriage waiting for a reason to be vindicated. She had nearly 14 years to wait. On the night of October 30th, 1955, there had been a dinner party at the home of Edith Baker on Long Island. The Woodwards had attended. They had returned to the Playhouse separately, in 2 cars. The local press in the weeks preceding had carried several reports of a prowler in the wealthy stretches of Long Island, and the Woodwards had taken to keeping loaded shotguns by their beds. They were sleeping in separate bedrooms that night. According to Anne's later account, she had been woken by a noise in the hallway. She had called out. There had been no answer. She had reached for her shotgun and fired in the dark. The shot had killed William Jr., who, by her account, had been standing in the doorway of her bedroom, holding his own shotgun, having come to investigate the same noise. The Nassau County Grand Jury heard the evidence. The grand jury declined to indict. Officially, the case was closed as a tragic accident. Unofficially, almost no one inside the world that mattered believed her. The whispered consensus inside the back banquettes of La Côte Basque was that the marriage had been failing, that William Jr. had been planning to leave, that Anne had been afraid of being cut off without a settlement, and that the prowler had been a useful fiction. Elsie Woodward paid for the defense. Elsie Woodward paid for the silence. Elsie Woodward then proceeded, for the next 20 years, to ensure that her daughter-in-law could not return to the social world she had married into. The reasoning, by Elsie's later account to friends, was practical rather than vengeful. To rebuke Anne openly would have suggested that the family did not believe her own grand jury verdict. To welcome Anne openly would have suggested that the family did not care whether she had murdered William Jr. So Elsie did neither. She simply did not include Anne in the photographs. Anne lived on. She inherited approximately $10 million, plus the use of the Playhouse, plus a trust that paid for her travel and her clothes. She had 2 sons, William III and James, both of whom would die by suicide, William in 1999 and James in 1978. She drank heavily. She traveled between New York, Paris, Lausanne, and various Mediterranean resorts. She was tolerated at the edges of parties she had once been at the center of. She was never readmitted to the booth. Truman Capote met her several times. He listened to her version of the story. He listened, more usefully for his purposes, to the other version, the one whispered by the Swans on whose side he had taken his seat. He decided that the other version was the better story. He began, in the late 1960s, to draft a chapter of his unfinished novel in which a woman named Ann Hopkins, a former Kansas chorus girl who had married into a banking family on Long Island, killed her husband by shotgun in a hallway and got away with it because her mother-in-law paid the lawyers. He showed the draft to a friend at a dinner party. The friend told another friend. The other friend told a third. The story, in approximate outline, began to circulate in Manhattan publishing circles by the autumn of 1972. A woman in Anne's position, with her own private knowledge of what had actually happened that night, knew exactly what was being drafted. She also knew, by 1974, that Capote was rumored to be sending the chapter to Esquire. She did not need to wait for the magazine to be printed to know what it would say. She had already heard her own version of it, whispered down the same booths she could no longer be seated in. Chapter 6. The Night. He made himself a king. On November 28, 1966, 540 masked guests walked into the Plaza Hotel for what the host insisted on calling a small dance, and the photograph of that room became the official portrait of the world he would later destroy. The party had a notional honoree. The honoree was Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, who had inherited the newspaper after her husband's suicide 3 years earlier, and was, at 49, learning, in public, to be the editor of one of the 4 most powerful papers in the United States. Capote had taken a quiet interest in her. He had decided that she needed a coming-out party. He had, in addition to caring about her, recognized that she gave him a respectable pretext for throwing the party he had been wanting to throw for years. He chose the Plaza Hotel, the grand ballroom on the first floor, the night of the Monday after Thanksgiving, 1966. He chose, as the dress code, black tie for men, black or white only for women, with masks. The color limit was a stroke of personal cruelty. It forced even the Swans, who had limitless wardrobes, into a kind of forced uniform that meant the differences between them would have to be communicated in other ways. The masks forced everyone in the room, for a moment at the start of the evening, to pretend they did not know who anyone else was, which had the effect of making it clear that they all did. He spent 6 months making the list. He worked on a series of yellow legal pads in his apartment at the United Nations Plaza with a vodka and orange juice within reach. He put names down. He took names off. He added arrows from name to name to indicate who must not sit near whom. He invited the Roosevelts. He invited the Vanderbilts. He invited Marlon Brando, Frank Sinatra, Mia Farrow, Andy Warhol, Tallulah Bankhead, Lauren Bacall, the Maharaja of Jaipur, Norman Mailer, William F. Buckley Jr., Henry Ford II, and Mrs. Ford, Cecil Beaton, the Agnellis, the Guinnesses, the Paleys, the Hayward Keiths, Lee, and Stanislaw Radziwill. He did not invite Anne Woodward. Elsie Woodward had personally asked him not to. He had personally agreed. The list, when complete, ran to 540 guests. Roughly half were from New York. The other half came in from Paris, London, Rome, Hollywood, and the major estates of the Eastern Seaboard. The cost of the party, including hotel rental, music, flowers, masks, and the catering, came to approximately $16,000 in 1966 dollars. In the currency of 2024, that figure sits at approximately $150,000, which sounds modest now and was understood at the time to be modest then. Capote did not need to spend more. The whole point was the list, not the lavishness. The list was the lavishness. The catering, supplied by the Plaza's kitchens, included approximately 450 pounds of beef stroganoff. The bar, supplied by Capote's friend Mike Pierman, who ran the bar at Voisin, included 6 cases of Teutinger champagne and what one staff member later estimated as approximately 800 bottles of mixed spirits. There were 300 individual chickens roasted in lemon and tarragon. There was a midnight breakfast of scrambled eggs and sausage for the guests who had survived the first 6 hours of dancing. The dancing was performed to 2 orchestras, Peter Duchin's band and a soul band whose name has not survived clearly. Duchin played the slow numbers. The soul band played from midnight onwards. The dance floor was unmasked at midnight by Capote's personal order. The masks came off in a single ripple, and the photograph that ran on the front page of the New York Times the following morning showed several hundred of the most powerful people in America looking for one suspended moment like a single audience for a single play, which was Capote's play, and in which he was the director. He stood near the entrance most of the evening. He greeted each guest by name. He had Babe Paley on one side of him for portions of the night, and Marella Agnelli on the other. He had Lee Radziwill at his table. He had Slim Hayward by the bar. He had Gloria Guinness in conversation near the orchestra. The photographers from Vogue, from Town and Country, from Life, from Women's Wear Daily, from The Times, recorded the geometry of the room. The geometry showed Capote at the center, and the Swans, in their black and white gowns, arranged like the chorus of an opera. It was the high water mark of his social capital. What no one in the room was paying attention to, because the party itself was so consuming, was the fact that he had not, by the night of November 28, 1966, written the novel that had bought him the credibility to throw this party. He had told Random House he would deliver answered prayers in early 1968. He had told Newsweek the same thing. He had told the New York Times in an interview the previous spring that he had about 400 pages of draft already in hand. He did not, in fact, have 400 pages of draft. He had pages of notes. He had outlines. He had a single completed scene set in a New Orleans hotel that would later survive as part of a chapter called Unspoiled Monsters. The rest of the novel was inside his head, where it would mostly stay. He had everything he needed. He was already lying about the thing he was using it to write. Chapter 7. The novel. He promised and could not write. For 9 years, he told everyone that answered prayers would be his Proust, and for 9 years what he actually had was a notebook full of other people's confessions. The first advance from Random House, paid in 1966, was $25,000. The first agreed delivery date was January of 1968. The first agreed length was around 400 pages. The novel, on its first commission, was conceived as a single book with around 8 chapters, structured around an alter ego named P.B. Jones, a small bisexual orphan from the South who works his way into the highest social circles of post-war New York and Paris by listening very carefully to women who do not realize they are being listened to. Jones was Capote. Even Capote was not pretending he was not. The delivery date of January 1968 was missed. The new delivery date, agreed in spring 1968, was 1970. The advance was renegotiated upward to $75,000. The second delivery date was missed. The third delivery date, agreed in 1972, was 1973. The advance was renegotiated upward again to $750,000, payable across the next set of delivery dates. The third delivery date was missed. By 1974, Random House's patience was thinning. Capote was 49 years old. He had not produced a new full-length book of fiction since Breakfast at Tiffany's in 1958. He had produced one masterpiece of nonfiction, In Cold Blood, in 1966. He had produced a number of essays and short pieces. He had produced one volume of collected magazine work. He had not, since the Plaza Ballroom emptied at 6 in the morning on November 29, 1966, written the great social novel he had been collecting material for since at least the early 1960s. He had not written the novel because he could not bear to. He had not written it because every time he sat down to make the Swans' lives into fiction, he had to hear, in his head, the specific voice of the specific woman whose confidence he was about to publish. He had to imagine the conversation that would follow. He had to picture Babe at Kelowna being asked by a journalist whether she recognized herself. He had to picture Slim opening Esquire. He delayed. He delayed in the manner that addicts delay. He went on television and explained that the novel was almost ready. He gave Newsweek a long interview in which he produced a typed page of what he called the manuscript and read it aloud. He told Andy Warhol, on tape, that the book was the best thing he had ever written. He told friends at dinner parties that he had 300 pages in a safe deposit box. He had perhaps 80. By 1973, the drinking had moved past social. He drank in the morning, he drank in the afternoon, he drank in the evening. He drank vodka and orange juice in a tumbler from approximately 10 in the morning onward. He had begun, in the late 1960s, to use prescription tranquilizers. He had moved, by the early 1970s, to a regular cocaine habit that he generally tried to keep private and that was beginning, by his appearances on The Dick Cavett Show, to leak out into public view. His writing routine, when there was one, had collapsed. He could no longer sit at a desk for the 4 to 6 hours a day a novel of this length required. He could write, on a good day, 2 pages. On a bad day, he wrote nothing. On a bad week, he gave a television interview in which he claimed to have written 10 pages a day. He believed on television that he was telling the truth. He had stopped knowing what the truth was. He decided, in the spring of 1975, that the only way to break the impasse was to publish something. He needed to put a chapter of answered prayers out into the world. He needed to do it under his own control, in a magazine, not as the book. He needed the reaction. He chose Esquire. He chose Esquire specifically because its editor at the time, Clay Felker, would pay him $16,000 for 40 pages of fiction, and because Esquire's circulation was high enough that the publication would be unmissable inside the world he wanted to publish about. He chose, as the chapter to send, one set inside La Côte Basque, written as a single long lunch on a single afternoon in the early 1970s, narrated by a thinly disguised woman called Lady Ina Coolbirth, who would tell the writer at her table every secret he had not heard yet, and several he had. He typed the chapter, in late spring and early summer of 1975, on a small portable typewriter at his beach house at Sagaponack on Long Island. He typed it in bursts, mostly in the mornings, before the vodka had quite caught up to him. He shaped it. He polished it. He removed some names and put in others. He thought, throughout the writing, that he was making art. He thought, in the section where Lady Ina narrates the story of a Kansas chorus girl who had killed her banker husband in a hallway, that he was making the best art of his life. He sent the manuscript to Esquire in the late summer of 1975. He did not show it in advance to Babe Paley. He did not show it to Slim Keith. He did not show it to Lee Radziwill, although Lee would later say that she had heard about it before publication and had not believed Capote would actually go through with it. He showed it to 2 or 3 friends, all of whom told him not to publish it. He told all of them that he was a great writer and that the Swans were not, and that they would forgive him, because great art was its own pardon. The Esquire issue was scheduled for December. The first advance copies began circulating inside the magazine industry in late October. By the second week of November, the issue was on the newsstands of Midtown Manhattan. A great deal had already happened by then. He did not know how much. Chapter 8. 44 pages. At the booth. In the autumn of 1975, he handed Clay Felker 44 pages set inside the only restaurant in America where these women were certain they were safe. The chapter, as it appeared in the December 1975 issue of Esquire, ran under the title La Côte Basque, 1975. The byline read, Truman Capote. The header described it as an excerpt from a novel in progress called Answered Prayers. The footer, in small type, thanked the magazine's lawyers, by which Esquire meant that the lawyers had read the piece and approved it. The premise was simple. The narrator, a writer called Jonesy, who is plainly Capote, takes a lunch at La Côte Basque with a tall, handsome woman called Lady Ina Coolbirth, who is plainly Slim Hayward. Over Bloody Marys and white burgundy and very small portions of sole, Lady Ina tells him a long succession of stories about the people at the other tables in the room. She tells him about a woman called Cleo Dillon, married to a powerful broadcasting tycoon called Sidney Dillon. She describes Sidney's compulsive infidelities. She tells, in close graphic detail, a story about a particular afternoon at the Pierre Hotel, on which Sidney took to bed the wife of a governor, and afterward had to deal with the bloodstains she had left, by which the story implies she had been menstruating. The afternoon was real, the governor was real, the wife was real. The bloodstain was the detail by which all of New York would identify the story within hours. Anyone of Babe Paley's generation reading this chapter understood instantly that Cleo Dillon was Babe and that Sidney Dillon was William Paley. The governor's wife, called in the story Mrs. Hopkins of Tennessee in some printings and Mrs. Mothhow in others, was widely understood to be Marie Harriman. Lady Ina then tells the story of a woman called Ann Hopkins, who had grown up in Kansas as the daughter of a streetcar man. Ann, who had married into a banking family and shot her husband by mistake one night, claiming a prowler. She tells, in the manner of a confidence, how the prowler had been an invention. She tells how the mother-in-law had paid the lawyers. She tells how everyone at the table now had known, at the time, that Ann Hopkins had killed her husband on purpose. Anyone of any age reading this chapter understood that Ann Hopkins was Ann Woodward. Lady Ina then makes several observations about a Mexican-born society wife who had married into the Guinness fortune. She implies that the Mexican-born wife had carried messages for the Germans during the Second World War. She names her, in the story, only as one of the most beautiful women in the world. Anyone of any age in the room of La Côte Basque understood that the wife was Gloria Guinness. Lady Ina also notes, in passing, the social maneuvers of a Polish prince's wife who was having an affair with a Greek shipping owner, which everyone reading understood to be Lee Radziwill and Aristotle Onassis. Marella Agnelli appears once, briefly, treated with the comparative gentleness Capote always reserved for her. The chapter ends with Lady Ina recognizing, very late in the lunch, that the writer at her table has been listening too carefully. She tells him, gently, that she has perhaps said too much. He insists that he has been delighted. He pays the bill. He leaves the restaurant. He goes home to write down what she said. The 44 pages were, in addition to a betrayal, a small structural masterpiece. They demonstrated everything Capote could do with a single conversation across a single lunch. They showed why Random House had been paying advances for 10 years. They were, in the cold judgment of 2 or 3 reviewers later, the best thing Capote had written since In Cold Blood. They were also, in the eyes of every person they described, an act of war. The publication of the chapter did several things at once. It established in fiction that Cleo Dillon's husband cheated. It established in fiction that Anne Hopkins had killed her husband. It established in fiction that the most beautiful woman in the world had been a Nazi spy. It established that the writer at the table, the one called Jonesy, had been allowed to hear all of this because he had been considered a friend. The point of the chapter, in the literary sense, was that he had not been a friend. He had been a writer. The point of the chapter, in the personal sense, was that he had been telling them all along, by his very presence at the table, that he was a writer, and they had refused to believe him. He waited in the first week of November 1975 for the reaction. He believed until the moment the phone began to ring that the reaction would be admiration. It was not. On Chapter 9, Fifth the Day. The phone stopped ringing. Within 24 hours of the December Esquire reaching the most important addresses in New York, every door he had walked through for 10 years was closed. The issue hit Manhattan newsstands on or around November 5th, 1975. The hardback copies that had circulated through the magazine industry from late October had already begun the work of preparation. By the morning of November 6th, the doormen of the major Park Avenue and Fifth Avenue buildings had been instructed which name not to admit. Slim Keith was the first to react. She was, by her own later account, in her Manhattan apartment on the morning the issue arrived. She read the chapter standing in her hallway, still wearing her coat. She recognized herself before she had finished the first page. She telephoned in succession Babe Paley, Gloria Guinness, and Lee Radziwill. She instructed her secretary to refuse Capote's calls. She did not, by her own account, weep. She did not break anything. She decided, in the time it took to walk from her hallway to her telephone, that she would not say his name aloud for the remainder of her life. She kept that decision. She did not say his name aloud for the remainder of his life. Whether she said it after he died is not recorded. Babe Paley read the issue at Kelowna, where Bill Paley was also present. By all surviving accounts, Babe finished the chapter in the morning room, set the magazine down on a side table, and said very quietly to her husband that she was so disappointed. The phrase, "I am so disappointed," was, in Babe's vocabulary, the strongest condemnation she had ever been observed to use. It was the phrase her mother had used to her about any number of childhood failures. It carried, inside the Cushing family, the weight of a slap. She gave her staff 2 instructions. The first was that every photograph of Truman Capote, currently displayed at Kelowna or at the St. Regis apartment, was to be removed by the end of the day. The instruction was carried out, and the photographs, of which there were many, were placed in a box, and the box was placed in a back closet where it was found after Babe's death by her daughter Amanda. The second instruction was that Capote was not to be admitted to either residence under any circumstance, and that any of his calls were to be redirected to a secretary who would refuse to take a message. She also instructed, more privately, that his name was not to be used in her hearing. She held to this instruction for the rest of her life, which lasted another 2 years and 8 months. She did not, in those years, speak to him. He attempted several times to reach her. He sent flowers. He sent letters. The letters were returned unopened by Bill Paley's instruction. He attempted to see her on one occasion in the spring of 1977, when he heard that she was being treated at New York Hospital for the lung cancer that had been diagnosed several years earlier. He was turned away at the elevator by a private nurse who had been told who he was. He stood in the lobby for some time. He went home. He did not see her again. Gloria Guinness telephoned her husband, Lowell, in Switzerland on the morning of November 6th and told him that she had been described in the December Esquire as a Nazi spy. Lowell telephoned his lawyer. The lawyer advised, after reading the piece, that a libel suit was not advisable because the chapter was published as fiction and the names had been thinly altered. The Guinness lawyer's advice was that the family should respond by complete withdrawal. They withdrew. The Guinness household in Switzerland, in Acapulco, in Paris, and on the Serena was closed to Capote. Gloria did not, by surviving record, ever speak to him again. Marella Agnelli, who had been treated comparatively gently in the chapter, telephoned Johnny in Italy. They conferred for several days. They concluded that Marella's gentle treatment could not be allowed to make a public exception. The Agnellis joined the closure. Marella, when later asked by interviewers, declined to discuss Capote at all. Lee Radziwill, who had been mentioned only briefly and who had not been substantially exposed, was, for that very reason, in the most difficult position. The other Swans suspected in the days after publication that Lee's mild treatment had been the price of an inside agreement with Capote. They did not say this aloud. They did not need to. Lee herself, finding that her closest friends had begun to cool, broke with Capote in the following months. She delivered, when later asked about him on television, the single sentence that would follow him to his grave: "Truman is a fag." The closure was geographical, as much as social. The phones at the East Side apartments stopped ringing. The maitre d' at La Côte Basque, a man named Maurice, declined to take Capote's reservation on Soulet's standing instruction, although Soulet himself had died in 1966, and the restaurant was now under different ownership. The maitre d' at Le Cirque, when Capote arrived without a reservation, found him a table near the kitchen. The head waiter at the Russian tea room developed very politely an inability to remember Capote's name. The phone calls he had been receiving daily from Slim, from Babe, from Lee, from Gloria, from Marella simply ceased. There was no scene, there was no shouting. There was, in the way of the world they ruled, simply silence. In the week after publication, Capote went to a number of restaurants. He sat alone. He drank. He waited for the Swans to call. They did not call. They were not going to call. He understood, in stages, what had happened. He had calculated, by his own later admission, that there would be a brief flurry of injured feelings, perhaps a public statement from Babe Paley, perhaps a magazine response, but that within a month he would be welcomed back into the booth with a fresh story about how he had been misunderstood, and that the Swans, after some initial pain, would come to see the chapter as the great compliment of their lives. He had calculated wrongly. He had not, in his calculation, accounted for two factors. The first was that the world he had decided to write about had a private rule he had been part of, without ever understanding. The rule was that what was said inside the booth stayed inside the booth. The rule was enforced, when broken, by complete erasure. He had broken it. He was being erased. The second was that one of the Swans, the one he had injured most clearly, was already dead. Chapter 10. The Suicide. 3 weeks before publication. 26 days before the magazine hit the newsstands, Anne Woodward swallowed enough Seconal to kill her 3 times over, and Elsie Woodward greeted the news as a tidy bit of social housekeeping. Anne Woodward died in her Manhattan apartment on October 10th, 1975. Seconal is a barbiturate. The amount she swallowed, by the toxicology report later filed, was at least 3 times a lethal dose. She was found the following morning by a member of her household staff. She was 60 years old. The circumstances around her death have been, for 50 years, the subject of a small but stubborn dispute. The claim that Anne Woodward killed herself the day before La Côte Basque, 1975, was published is, on its face, inaccurate. The chapter was not on the public newsstands until the first week of November. She died on October 10th. The chapter was, however, already circulating in advance copies among the small population of editors, agents, and well-connected social figures who routinely receive such copies, and the contents had been described in private conversation since at least the previous autumn. There are 2 competing versions of how Anne came to know what was in the chapter. In the first version, which was the one Capote later told his biographer Gerald Clark, Anne had been shown a galley of the chapter by a mutual friend in New York, publishing sometime in early October. She had read it, recognized herself, gone home, and taken the pills. The friend in this version was acting either from spite or from a misguided attempt to warn her. In the second version, which has been advanced by the Woodward family and several of Anne's friends, Anne had been hearing for several years that Capote was writing such a chapter and had been told, in early October, that the chapter was about to publish. She had decided that the public republication of the original 1955 accusation was the one social blow she had not been prepared to absorb, and she had elected to die on her own terms. In this version, she had not necessarily read a galley. She had only needed to know it was coming. The 2 versions are not, on close reading, incompatible. They agree on the central point. Anne had a clear and accurate understanding by early October 1975 that within the next month, a chapter of an Esquire novel by Truman Capote would tell in lightly altered names the story of how she had murdered her husband and been protected. She decided not to be alive when the magazine reached the newsstands. The reaction of her mother-in-law has been recorded several times. in several slightly different forms, all of which agree on the tone. Elsie Woodward, who was then 80 years old and who had outlived not just her son, but, by her own accounting, the social misjudgment that had brought him to that night in 1955, was telephoned at her Fifth Avenue apartment with the news on the morning of October 11th. She was reported, in the version her grandsons would later confirm, to have said something close to, "Well, that's that. She shot my son, and Truman just murdered her. And so, now I suppose we don't have to worry about that anymore." The phrase, "we don't have to worry about that anymore," referred to the question of how to manage Anne within the family's continuing social calendar. Anne had been a problem for 20 years. The problem was now solved. Truman Capote, told the news in late October, made a number of public and semi-public responses, most of which functioned as self-exoneration. He said, in private, that Anne had been planning to kill herself for years. He said that the magazine chapter was incidental. He said, in one widely circulated remark, "Well, that's that. She shot her husband, and now she's killed herself, and they were both terrible people anyway." The phrasing of the remark, very close to Elsie Woodward's, was widely understood at the time to be a deliberate parroting by Capote of Elsie's own line, repeated back into print as a way of making clear to anyone listening that the family's reaction to Anne's death and his reaction to Anne's death were essentially the same. The remark, on its face cold, did not protect him. The other Swans were already reading The Galleys of La Côte Basque, 1975, and had concluded by mid-October that the Anne Hopkins chapter had been the cause of Anne Woodward's death. Babe Paley said in private, in late October, that Truman had killed Anne. Slim Keith said the same thing in different words. When the issue itself reached the newsstands 2 weeks later, the Swans were no longer merely reacting to an injury to themselves. They were reacting to the death of a woman they had not liked and had not let inside their world, but whom they now agreed, by a private logic, had been part of their world after all, and to whom Capote had done something for which there was no forgiveness. He had not understood, at the moment he handed the chapter to Esquire, that Anne would die. He had not, by his own later account, intended to kill her. He had, however, intended to publish the story, and the story, once published, was understood inside the booth to have killed her. The distinction did not matter. The first Swan was already gone before he could see what he had done. Chapter 11. The Long, Slow Death of the Writer. He spent the next 9 years drinking in restaurants where they sat him at the back and pretending on television that he was about to deliver the novel he could no longer write. The years between November of 1975 and August of 1984 were the longest of his life. He gave interviews in which he asserted, falsely, that the Swans had begun to call him back. He gave interviews in which he asserted, falsely, that the rest of Answered Prayers was almost finished. He gave interviews in which he asserted, accurately, that he was a great writer who had been misunderstood by a small social set, who would not in the end matter to literature. He gave interviews in which he wept on camera. He gave interviews in which he could barely speak. The most famous of these interviews took place on July 18, 1978, with a young Australian television host named Stanley Siegel on Siegel's morning program in New York. Capote arrived at the studio at approximately 7 in the morning. He sat down in the chair. He was visibly impaired. He had not slept. He was drunk and high simultaneously. Siegel began the interview by asking what was going to happen if Capote did not stop drinking. Capote, on live television, said, "The obvious answer is that eventually I will kill myself." The interview ran for approximately 20 minutes. It is, in 2026, still available in clips on the internet. It remains the single most public document of a public figure's decline that American television had produced to that point. It was followed, within a week, by Capote's entry into a clinic in upstate New York. He went into clinics repeatedly. He came out of them. He stayed clean for periods of 2 and 3 weeks. He resumed. He published, in 1976, a chapter from Answered Prayers called Unspoiled Monsters, set largely in the South. He published in 1976 and 1977 a chapter called Kate McLeod. He did not publish anything substantial after that. He continued, for the remainder of his life, to insist that the book was nearly done. Babe Paley died on July 6, 1978. She was 63. The lung cancer that had been diagnosed in 1974 had finally taken her. She died at the Paley apartment, surrounded by her daughters. She had spent her last months, by surviving account, planning her own memorial service in considerable detail. She had given specific instructions about the food, the seating, the music, and the dress code, in the manner of a woman who had spent her entire life planning parties and intended to plan this one. The list of attendees she gave to Bill Paley did not include Truman Capote. He was not invited. He did not attend. He sent flowers. The flowers were refused. He understood, in the months after Babe's death, that the closure was now permanent. There would be no return. The longest and deepest friendship of his adult life had ended without reconciliation. He had not been allowed to say goodbye. Gloria Guinness died on November 9, 1980, in Lausanne, of an aneurysm. She was 68. She had not spoken to Capote in 5 years. She did not, in her remaining years, give any public interview in which his name was mentioned. He continued to drink. He continued to give interviews. He moved between New York and Los Angeles, where he had a long-standing friendship with Joanne Carson, the second wife of the television host Johnny Carson. He stayed with her in her house in Bel Air, in his last years, for periods of weeks at a time. He was admitted to UCLA Medical Center several times. His liver was failing. He had developed, on top of the alcoholism, a long-term phlebitis in his legs that made it difficult to walk. He had a series of minor strokes. He retained, despite all of this, the small voice and the small drawl that had charmed his way into Park Avenue 30 years earlier. He died on August 25, 1984, at Joanne Carson's house in Bel Air, at the age of 59. The official cause of death was liver disease complicated by multiple drug intoxication. He had been in failing health for years. He had been refusing serious treatment for at least a year. He had told Joanne Carson, the day before his death, that he did not want to be saved. His funeral was small. The crematorium was small. His ashes were divided into 2 urns, one of which Joanne Carson kept in her house in Bel Air. The urn was stolen in a famous burglary in 1988 and was returned in a less famous return several months later. The Swans did not attend. The flowers they did not send were not sent. Chapter 12. What Trust Costs. Inside. A booth, 50 years later, the booth is gone, the restaurant is gone, and the women are mostly gone, but the story he sold is the only thing left of any of them. La Côte Basque closed on March 7, 2004. It had moved, in 1995, from 5 East 55th Street to a new address at 60 East 55th. It had been bought and sold several times. It was, by the early 2000s, no longer the social court it had been. The building at the original address was eventually torn down. The Bernard Lamotte murals were removed in 1995 and later sold at auction. The world of the booth by then had been gone for 15 years. Kelowna Farm, the Paley's Long Island estate, was broken up and sold after Bill Paley's death in October of 1990. Pieces of it survive as residential parcels. The art collection that Babe had spent 25 years assembling was dispersed at auction. A portion of it went to the Museum of Modern Art, where it is still on display in galleries Bill Paley endowed in his lifetime. The Guinness yacht, the Serena, passed through several hands and was eventually broken up. The villa near Lausanne was sold. Gloria's jewelry collection, when auctioned at Christie's in 1981, realized approximately £4 million. The Agnelli holdings, including Villar Perosa and La Leopolda, remain in family hands. Marella outlived almost all of them and died on February 23, 2019, in Turin. Her son, Edoardo, had died, before her, in 2000. Her daughter, Margarita, survived her. Lee Radziwill died on February 15, 2019, in her New York apartment. She had given a long interview to Sofia Coppola in 2013, in which she had said, at last, a small number of things about Capote, all of which were either elegiac or carefully cool. She had outlived him by 35 years. She had outlived her sister by 25. Slim Keith died on April 6, 1990, in New York, of cancer. She had married, after the events of this story, the English banker Sir Kenneth Keith, who became Lord Keith of Castleacre. She had written a memoir in 1990 called Slim, Memories of a Rich and Imperfect Life, which had described Capote and his betrayal in detail. The memoir had been her last word on the subject. She had not, in her final years, said his name in casual conversation. Anne Woodward's sons died by suicide. James, the younger, on September 5, 1978, in a fall from a window on the 14th floor of a Manhattan hotel. William, the elder, on November 14, 1999, also by a fall from a window. The Woodward line through Anne had effectively ended. Elsie Kreider? Woodward outlived her daughter-in-law by 6 years. She died on March 7, 1981, at the age of 98. Capote himself is buried at Westwood Memorial Park in Los Angeles. His grave is not large. The unfinished novel was published in the form Random House could assemble from his papers in 1986, 2 years after his death, under the title Answered Prayers, the unfinished novel. It runs to approximately 180 pages. It contains the original La Côte Basque, 1975, chapter unchanged. It contains the 2 other published chapters. It contains a short additional fragment. It does not contain the great social novel he had promised for 10 years. There was, when the editors went through his papers, nothing else to find. The story of the Swans returned to the public conversation in January of 2024, when Ryan Murphy's anthology series Feud aired its 2nd season, titled Capote vs. the Swans, on the FX cable network. The series cast Naomi Watts as Babe Paley, Diane Lane as Slim Keith, Callista Flockhart as Lee Radziwill, Demi Moore as Anne Woodward, Chloe Sevigny as CZ Guest, Molly Ringwald as Joanne Carson, and Tom Hollander as Capote. The series ran for 8 episodes. It was watched by the time the season closed by an audience of several million people, the majority of whom had never previously heard the names of the 6 women involved. The story he had sold for $16,000 in 1975 had been resold, 50 years later, into a different medium for a much larger fee, to a public that had no memory of the original. The Swans, who had spent their lives constructing the most carefully guarded public images of any women of their generation, are now most famous for the chapter Capote wrote about them. They are, in the long view of cultural history, defined by the man they had trusted. This is the philosophical truth at the bottom of the story. The Paleys, the Guinnesses, the Agnellis, the Woodwards, the Radzawills employed armies of lawyers, accountants, doormen, household staff, and chauffeurs to protect the financial perimeter of their lives. None of those armies could protect them from the one small man they had invited inside. He was not after their money. He was after their stories. The stories were the only asset that had not been insured because nobody in their world had imagined a thief who could come in through a friendship. There is a second truth visible only on careful reading. The Swans did not survive Capote because they were stupid or weak. Babe Paley spoke 4 languages and ran one of the largest private art collections in America. Gloria Guinness had crossed wartime Europe with nothing on her own side. Slim Keith had been at the center of 3 industries by the age of 40. They were not naive women. What they lacked was a route out of unhappy marriage that the culture of their decade would have permitted them to take. The friendship with Capote was, in part, the survival workaround a sexist system had forced on them. He weaponized exactly the survival strategy the system had left them. That is what he should be judged for, and that is what, by his own admission near the end of his life, he could not stop judging himself for. The third truth is about us. The audience that watches the Ryan Murphy series, the audience that buys the books, the audience that watches this video, is doing something the Swans themselves did. We are listening at the booth. Capote sold the secrets of the most private women in America to a magazine. We have been buying them, in different forms, every year since. Whatever verdict we render on him, the verdict on the listener has to be rendered also. The booth is gone, the reading goes on. If this story is the kind you keep thinking about after the screen goes dark, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Then, before you go, tell me down in the comments where you are watching from, and which of the 6 Swans, knowing what you now know, you would have wanted to be. Share this with someone who still believes wealth keeps a person safe. You are the reason this channel exists.